Hi, and welcome to another episode of NXIVM on Trial, a Times Union podcast, our first in a little bit more than a year. I am Casey Seiler, editor-in-chief of the Times Union, joined by
Robert Gavin, cops and courts reporter.
And Jessica Marshall, multimedia producer and producer of NXIVM on Trial.
And we are here to talk about the second season of HBO's The Vow, the documentary series on the decline and fall of the shadowy organization known as NXIVM.
You're going to be the agent of change.
Imagine you spent 22 years trying to build something, and everybody thinks it's the devil's work.
For the next 6 weeks, we are going to be reviewing each new episode of The Vow as it comes out. We are talking Tuesday morning, the morning after the release of the first episode, the title of which was Tests of Loyalty. To start off, let's just go around the horn and talk about our reaction to this first episode and sort of what it means for The Vow and kind of the public perception of NXIVM. Rob, you covered the federal trial of Keith Raniere day by day, so let's start with you.
The first episode, I thought, started pretty consistent with where the last season ended. We saw Keith Raniere's arrest at the end of the first season, and now we move on to the trial phase. What I thought was interesting is, in actuality, Keith Raniere and Allison Mack were charged initially, and then the superseding indictment was a few months later. It wasn't entirely clear in the episode that was two separate instances. They showed Mark Vicente and his wife Bonnie Peace, who were huge parts of the first season of The Vow. Those are both NXIVM defectors, looking at their cell phones and seeing that the superseding indictment had come down on Keith, Allison Mack, Claire Bronfman, Lauren Salzman, and of course Nancy Salzman, who is apparently going to be a very big part of this series, as she is shown in the trailers and in this episode of having spoken at length to The Vow.
What would happen if each of my secrets came out?
Arrested today, Nancy Salzman, as well as her daughter, Lauren Salzman.
The upside of letting go of your secrets is that you will have a lot more freedom.
Yeah, and just to establish the timeline here, it was the fall, right around this time in 2017, almost exactly 5 years ago, that the New York Times broke the story about DOS, the secret organization within NXIVM that was essentially a sexual slavery pyramid scheme where women handed over so-called collateral, which is basically blackmail material, and were essentially turned into, and this was the explicit word that was used, slaves for folks higher up in this structure. That really brought NXIVM down. And then Keith Raniere was arrested in the late winter, early spring of 2018. And then, as you note, the superseding indictment of 5 women within NXIVM's leadership structure, including Nancy Salzman, Claire Bronfman, who was the Seagram's heiress, who was a funder of many of NXIVM's operations, as well as Lauren Salzman, the daughter of Nancy Salzman, Allison Mack, who was a higher up within DOS, the former Smallville actress, and Nancy Russell. Do I have that name correct? Who was
Kathy Russell?
Kathy Russell. Thank you, Rob. Who was the essentially kind of the bookkeeper for NXIVM. And then in early 2019, in what was going to be the run-up to the federal trial, they all pleaded guilty to various charges. Nancy Salzman pleaded to racketeering, wasn't it, Rob?
Yeah, racketeering, conspiracy. Nancy and her daughter, Lauren Salzman, pled guilty to racketeering and racketeering conspiracy. Nancy's now serving 3.5 years in prison in West Virginia on that charge.
Yeah, they all pleaded guilty, leaving Keith Raniere to stand alone, and he was convicted, as they say, on all charges. He is now at a federal facility outside of Tucson, Arizona, where he, as far as the federal government would like to have it, will be for the rest of his natural life. But yes, you're right. It seemed like the timeline could get a little bit confusing, and there was a lot of kind of shuttling back and forth to the arrest in Mexico, for example, which I think it seemed like provided some of the most gripping footage. I had not seen that cell phone footage of Raniere's arrest before, where he was essentially found in a closet.
Definitely some of the most riveting testimony was Lawrence Salzman explaining how the authorities came into their hotel room. And at the time, this is about March 25th, 2018, they're in a little fishing village in Mexico known as Chicala. And this is where Raniere is hanging out for the night, hoping to meet up with a number of his former quote unquote slaves, their current slaves at the time. And the police come in, and when they come in, Lauren Salzman testifies that she has 4 guns pointed at her head. And she's essentially there putting her hands up for Keith, and Keith Raniere hid in a closet. So that was a huge part of the testimony, that she said, I couldn't believe that I would be there for Keith and that Keith would be there for Keith. You know, and at the time, Lauren is still extremely loyal to Keith Raniere, but that's sort of a huge dent in the armor, so to speak, looking back, that when the police came for Keith, he was looking out for himself, hiding in a closet in the villa while she faced machine guns.
Jess, what was your response to this first episode? Both, I would say, as a NXIVM observer and as just kind of somebody who well understands TV technique, documentary technique.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of how I was looking at this episode, because, I came into this, thinking that I'd read and heard everything that there was to know about the trial. We covered a lot of that on this podcast, as well as Rob's fine reporting. There were things that I learned that were new, but I was mainly looking at it from a filmmaking perspective. I was very curious coming in, and the first episode didn't necessarily answer this question for me, but very curious coming in as to how they were going to cover the trial itself, because obviously there's no cameras or any recording devices in the courtroom. I mean, I remember when we went for Alice and Mac's sentencing, I was basically stripped of every single digital device that I had when I walked into the courthouse itself. So there was no chance to really record what was happening. I kind of ended the first episode really still wondering how that was going to be conducted. But I was fascinated by some of the new things that I learned, like the bit with Karen Unterreiner, where, she just kind of casually walks over to a bookshelf and pulls off Keith's mom's ashes in a can. Like, that was just kind of a moment that I was, I didn't really expect. It was a very small thing, but it was kind of just a startling moment that I just kind of, can't forget now.
Next to the ashes of a cat.
Exactly. His cat, right? What was the cat's name?
Was it Cuddles?
Cuddles.
Yeah, I mean, what kind of and Karen Unterreiner, for those maybe not familiar with this full dramatis personae, is one of the many NXIVM former girlfriends of Keith Raniere, who was ultimately targeted by the organization and kind of fed into the litigation meat grinder that NXIVM deployed against those who were seen as having betrayed Keith. So the idea that, I mean, what kind of person leaves his mother's ashes with a former girlfriend, who you end up targeting? Perhaps somebody who does not have the best of relations with women, perhaps? I don't know.
I mean, the thing about Karen you got to remember is Karen Unterreiner goes back to the very beginning with Keith Raniere. Karen went to RPI with Keith. That's when he met Karen Unterreiner. She was a very high-ranking member of the organization who lived in Knox Woods. They showed during the episode last night where Keith Raniere lived on Flintlock. That was that little drive in the Knox Woods development in Half Moon. And Karen is one of the people who's part of Keith's inner circle. She's one of these women that he surrounded himself with. And they showed some videotape too of Pam Fritz and a number of people who was there at the beginning. And he's one of these people who's very intelligent. And you saw last night's episode how she's basically saying, I want to be you. I want to be everything you are, and that's very consistent with what we've seen with people who were in NXIVM. They have this sort of idolization of Keith Raniere, like he's sort of up there. To quote Mark Vicente's testimony from the trial, it's like they saw him as some kind of god, and you look at just the way people gaze upon him. He's built up into this huge figure, and Karen's someone who, I've spoken to Karen. She's a very intelligent person. She's one of many people that when you meet them, there's this sort of question of how could you get pulled into this? But as we've heard from a number of cult experts, that everybody is susceptible to this sort of coercive control that cults have. And in last night's episode, I thought, in addition to Keith's mother's ashes, which honestly, that was like something right out of the trial. I mean, as Jess said, there's that jolt of like, did I really just hear that? Did I really just see that? That's what the trial was like. It was every day something like that. I think Karen's comments about Nancy's potential knowledge of DOS, I had never heard that before. That was really interesting. And I don't want to say that she said Nancy definitely knew, because we certainly understood that Nancy was not in the loop with that. But I thought that was interesting that she kind of indicated that Nancy had heard something. And I think a big part of this series going forward is going to be how it portrays Nancy Salzman, because Nancy is clearly, just based on what we've seen in the trailer, there's this notion of, hey, I was just doing my job for 20 years and what happened and I didn't know. And meanwhile, the federal authorities found $515,000 in the basement of Nancy's house. There's, she admitted essentially weaponizing the legal system to go after people, and being aware of many things, and which I think will come out in this series, if it hasn't already, is that Nancy parroted Keith Raniere's teachings about women feeling freedom while being raped, and his theories about children being quote unquote adult-like. I mean, Nancy spoke all these things, and she was to an extent a victim of Keith Raniere, as we've reported. He was very manipulative and abusive to Nancy as well, but that history, it speaks for itself. And, right as this show is airing, Nancy's in a federal jail cell. So, yeah. So to me, that'll be very interesting. If you look, you'll see, I'm hearing from a number of people who had been associated with the case who have told me they're very concerned that Nancy is essentially going to come off looking way better than she should.
The line between, you've got victims, you've got perpetrators, and then you've got sort of collaborators, that kind of in between category. And in the case of NXIVM, it can be a bit tricky. But you mentioned the money that was found in Knox Woods. I would recommend that people check out a very good piece that appeared on npr.org by Linda Holmes. The headline is "What's Missing from the Second Season of the Cult Documentary The Vow," that notes that
was in Oregon Trail. That's not Knox Woods. It's a block over.
But I'm glad you pointed that out, Rob, because there's one point where Albany is referenced as being sort of the home of NXIVM. And speaking as an Albany resident, like Jess and like you, Rob, I bridled at that.
Absolutely, 100%, yeah.
Don't put this off on Albany, please. Albany has enough bad reputation.
Or Clifton Park.
There's at least 25 miles between Albany and Knox Woods.
Exactly.
Most of it's actually Half Moon. And I'd sit there during the trial and they'd say Clifton Park, New York. And I was kind of saying under my breath, it's Half Moon. It's Clifton Park.
But thank you for that. But Linda Holmes points out, and she's, I believe, has seen all 6 episodes, that there isn't enough talk about money, not enough questioning about the business structure of NXIVM, how these people earned a living, and exactly what role the money played in keeping these people tied to Raniere. That especially came out in even just the beginning of the description of sort of Nancy Salzman's role in NXIVM and Nikki Klein in her interview, and we should note that a number of the NXIVM loyalists, if you will, are interviewed in this first episode as well. They talk about Keith's initial, what was determined to be a pyramid scheme that was ultimately shut down, but they don't really talk about how the money flowed within NXIVM, who was being supported, who was earning a big salary, and who essentially was just there for food and lodging.
There's a lot of talk at the sentencings of various people in NXIVM where you hear about how NXIVM used people and did not pay them a lot of money. And they would often have that sort of deal with, well, if you can bring in more people, like a classic pyramid scheme, or you need to take more classes, and oh, well, if you take this, you have to take this. And they would essentially keep people on a conveyor belt to run, and it was a huge moneymaker. If you were to look at the house Nancy Salzman lived in Half Moon, I mean, it's a beautiful house. It's huge. Keith Raniere lived in another house down the street. It's huge. We know the Bronfmans had money. If you look at Knox Woods, it's your basic suburban townhouse development. But there was a lot of money flowing through NXIVM. There was a lot of money coming from Mexico, coming into NXIVM. And look at the attorneys across the capital region. You aren't able to, the term is used, weaponize the legal system to the extent that NXIVM was able to do without having the financial means to hire attorneys to do that. Most criminal organizations that are not financially viable can't actually even consider doing something like that. NXIVM had the financial means to actually do that, and that's how they were able to basically terrorize people through litigation for years. And that's a huge part of this case. I know people talk about DOS, and they should. It's sexual abuse. We know that. But a big part of this case is that Ponzi scheme type victimization that happened. Part of the case against Keith Raniere is forced labor conspiracy. We know the young woman, and to this day we've never identified her in our coverage, who was ordered to be in a room for almost 2 years. She was also a victim of forced labor. There were people in NXIVM who were not paid for their work, and meanwhile there's money flowing in all over the place. It's not like people joining NXIVM, a lot of them were not poor. Nikki Klein was on Battlestar Galactica, and I thought her comments were pretty interesting. She says, when she joined, people do all kinds of things to get to know themselves better. They go backpacking in Europe. They visit ashrams in India. I happen to go to Albany.
Not Albany, Knox Woods.
Yeah, and that is funny. Nikki Klein did live in Knox Woods. And here's someone who was a successful actress. She joined. She was married to Allison Mack, another successful actress. She joined.
But I do think that, while I agree with Linda Holmes' assessment of the overall series, I've seen all 6 episodes. And without spoiling anything, obviously, I think that the series overall has focused more on, some of the women that we hadn't necessarily heard from, and, kind of delves into why these strong, smart, seemingly self-possessed women would fall under Keith Raniere's sway, why they would do some of these deplorable things that they ultimately ended up doing. I think the series really stays focused on that as it goes throughout all of the episodes and begins to cover the trial. And, for me personally, and I know everybody, a large number of people were wondering, well, how is Nancy going to explain away her actions? And I think that this episode at least really kind of teased that up well. The end where she walks into the scene and sits down on her couch, and you're like, okay, we're going to hear from her now. I think they did a very good job in this episode of portraying that. A lot of the questions that I had personally about why these women were doing the things that they were doing, I think that they really gave them a chance to explain that in a way that, someone who kind of thinks that why would these women do this? Why would they let themselves be tricked like this? Like, it really adds some perspective to that, I think.
And one of the most interesting things I heard in episode 1 was that Karen Unterreiner, that Keith Raniere met her right after her father had died. And if you talk to the people who've been in NXIVM, they will almost to a person talk about how Keith would meet you where you were at. He was able to channel something in people. He'd find a weakness, or he'd find something in someone, and he would just find that way to exploit it for his whether it's his own sexual interest, whether he wanted to. There's always been an aspect to Keith, the more you look into this case, of he sort of likes to be the person holding the strings, sort of. You ask, how can intelligent people fall into this? And like I've said before, everyone is vulnerable. But that I thought was interesting, that Karen Unterreiner's father had just died. Many of the people involved are very intelligent. Some of them are very talented people, but in some cases they're very wounded people going in. Everybody has their weaknesses, and I think in the case of the victims of NXIVM, they were able to go to a place they thought for help. And in going to NXIVM, you have to give out a lot of information. It's designed to get information from you, so they're going to find out your weaknesses. Exploration of meanings, which are called EMs. You're giving information to these people, and what really is horrifying is this is someone you're going to for self-help. I mean, this is a personal development company. You're going there to better yourself, and Keith exploited that.
17,000 people got good results. Where are they?
Well, if 17,000 people all had good results, we wouldn't be watching Nancy Salzman on The Vow.
And I think too, going back to the filmmaking perspective, I think the use of archival footage, Keith wanted everything that he had ever done documented, and the way they used some of this archival footage where, Keith would be saying a certain something and they would pull in and you'd kind of get more subtle facial expressions and movements, I think really sold the idea, the concept of how he held sway over people. It was really well done, I think, from a filmmaking perspective and use of archival footage that way.
Along with that, I'd just like to point out something that I find to be a bit more problematic, which is when people are interviewed on The Vow, you only hear them talking. I don't think we have ever heard an interlocutor, asking a question. It is rare, almost to the vanishing point. And I think that is really problematic when you are trying to, as a journalist, I'm kind of resistant to that. It's Robert Caro, the great journalist and biographer, who said, let silence work for you when you're doing an interview. But at the same time, I mean, you got to ask probing questions. You've got to be a little bit adversarial at times, especially when you're dealing with a case like this, where there is so much prevarication and salesmanship, which probably isn't the right word. And I find that to be especially troubling in this episode. And once again, Jess, you've seen the whole thing. This episode's treatment of many of the NXIVM loyalists, that the things they say do not appear to be kind of questioned or challenged in any way. And maybe later on in the series we will get to that, but it certainly wasn't there in the first ep.
One of the things that'll come up during the NXIVM trial is gaslighting. And for those who don't know what it means, it's basically saying up is down, down is up. You're making someone think they're going insane when they're not. And Keith Raniere employed that. And really, I mean, for Nancy Salzman to act like, hey, what gives when you pled guilty? And I understand that this recording was obviously taken before she went to federal prison, but Nancy Salzman has pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy. The people that are supporting Keith Raniere to this day, they're his supporters, and they are entitled to their opinions, but there's also facts, and that Keith Raniere is, in this case, many of the things, they're on tape. A good example is, there's an effort in the courts by his supporters to try to say that, hey, he was framed and there was FBI corruption and they planted evidence. But there's also evidence. We saw emails. We heard him on tape talking about young children. We saw emails which you couldn't print the things that were put in these emails, where it's clear he was, I think from anybody objectively looking at it, was engaging in a relationship with someone who was underage. And we've reported that. In fact, Moira Penza, the lead prosecutor, just did a tweet earlier this morning about how the Times-Union, and this is going back to our coverage years ago, had secrets of NXIVM, and that we were reporting in 2012 about Keith's involvement with underage women, and that was 2012. So for Nancy to say 10 years later, what gives? I mean, it's not like this was a secret. It was out there.
You make a good point. And that was a real problem that I had with the first season of The Vow, that it mentioned that 2012 Times Union series by Jennifer Gish and Jim Odato that detailed a lot of the allegations that Raniere had mistreated women, had wildly inappropriate, illegal relations with younger women, teenagers, basically, and nobody did anything. And in The Vow, it was glossed over, like an ice rink, with Mark Vicente essentially saying, well, yes, it disturbed me, but I went to Keith and he had an explanation for everything. And I'm sorry, that's just wildly insufficient. I would like to know going forward, and just don't give it away, whether or not any of that is brought up with Nancy Salzman, because she owes an explanation on how she and the organization handled those revelations.
No spoilers, I promise.
All right.
I'm curious to see your reactions to episode 2 next week.
All right. Perfect teaser. Thank you, Jess. Thanks very much for listening. We will be back next week. I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Times Union. Thanks very much to Rob Gavin, our outstanding Cops and Courts reporter, and Jessica Marshall, our award-winning multimedia producer, winning an award just this weekend from the Journalists Association of New York for our podcast, The Eagle. Please go check it out.
If you're enjoying NXIVM on Trial, be sure to check out its sister podcast, The Eagle. I'm Jessica Marshall, host of The Eagle. Each week, we'll take a look inside the newsroom at the Times Union, the Capital Region's oldest and largest newspaper. We'll discuss the week's top stories, and we'll talk to the award-winning reporters who write them. Listen at timesunion.com or wherever you get your podcasts.